Virginia, I'm just going to say a few words, and then you'll come on up, okay? So, Virginia, Marylis's counselor. She's going to join us to really discuss what domestic violence is and what it is not. There's lots of ideas. She is a retired social worker who has worked for nearly 40 years in the fields of mental health and domestic violence. I would say you're a pioneer, Virginia. She received her BA in theology from Villaparosa University and her master's in social work from Washington University in St. Louis. She has served as vice president of the board of directors of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, and also served for 3 terms on the board of Progressive Christians Uniting. She is an advisor to the Peace and Justice Program Group of the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, and is an active member in the work of ending prolonged solitary confinement in California prisons. Virginia has been a gun violence prevention activist for over 20 years and has been the chair of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force at All Saints Church in Pasadena. She's also president of the San Fernando Valley chapter of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. No? Yes. Lauren is. Were you?
I was.
Well, all right. We have 2 presidents. Good ones. Welcome to Virginia. Please, help me welcome Virginia Pointer.
Do you mind if I speak from here?
No, not at all.
Turn the mic on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
And Alan is going to help me with the slides because I've never done that before. I'm really technologically challenged. Thank you. An understanding of the dynamic an article in Atlantic in 2013 used similar language in the title, "A Same-Sex Domestic Violence Epidemic is Silent." Domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse, I will use those terms interchangeably, most profoundly affects the victims, but has been said repeatedly, profoundly affects the children who witness abuse, and this abuse is often carried into adult lives. There's a high correlation between IPA and homelessness, between exposure to abuse and community violence. Many young people in juvenile facilities and adult prisons grew up in homes where there was domestic abuse. And I specifically use intimate partner abuse or domestic abuse and not domestic violence. I avoid domestic violence. Physical violence is recognized, but most intimate partner abuse is not physical. And so the term can lead to believe people who have not experienced physical violence to believe that they have not been abused, when they have in fact been seriously abused verbally, psychologically, and emotionally. And a word about language. While there are men who are victims of abuse, both in heterosexual and same-gendered relationships, overall it is women who make up the larger number of victims of abuse. I will attempt to use inclusive language, but if I use she, please know that this applies to all victims. So I hope you will leave here with a greater understanding of 3 things. That abuse is not a relationship problem, how abuse affects the victim, and what the barriers are to people leaving, or one might accurately use the term escaping an abusive situation. And these slides were originally prepared for All Saints Church for a presentation, so if there's some things that appear on the slides that are not pertinent here, that's why they might be on those slides. And so we begin. What is domestic abuse? First of all, it's important to know what it is not. It is not a relationship problem. This is why couples counseling is not indicated and in fact can be very, very dangerous. We might think about relationships on a continuum with wonderful, idyllic relationships on one end, and then normal relationships with some disagreements in the middle, and then on the other extreme, really difficult, conflicted relationships. That is not what domestic abuse is. Erase that thought completely. Abuse resides completely with the abuser and is constructed to have domination, power, and control over a partner with the goal of creating complete dependency. The victim never causes it, and the victim can never stop it. The Department of Justice defines abuse in this way. It's a pattern of abusive behavior used by one partner to gain power over another. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological. These are actions that damage another person. Next. We will begin with what is the most widely used document in the field of domestic abuse called the power and control wheel. Note, this is not called the domestic abuse or domestic violence wheel. It's called the power and control wheel. So if you read around this, and there's also a copy in your folder if that's easier, think of this in terms of how these various things are used to whittle down the self-esteem of someone and completely gain power and control. The intimidation, making someone feel afraid by looks, gestures, destroying personal property, often very precious heirlooms. The emotional abuse, and we'll talk about that a bit more. The isolation. Isolating a partner is a very important goal, because if you are isolated, I think we all like to know those people we could call at 3 in the morning and say, my car broke down, will you come and get me? And they would say, of course, I'll be right there. When you are isolated and you have no one to turn to, then the dependency is complete. The denying, minimizing, using children, and this is particularly true with undocumented women. If you report me to the police, I will report you as undocumented and that you will never see your children again. The economic abuse, controlling all of the money, sabotaging efforts to get ahead. Maybe you go back to school and your partner arranges the physical abuse for the night before your final exam, always sabotaging your efforts. The gender privilege, the coercion and threats. So this is the first document people get when they typically start working in the field. The rates of abuse are pretty similar in same-gendered and heterosexual relationships. So let's go through this in a bit more detail. The next slide. Verbal abuse is designed specifically to cut to the core of a person, to destroy any sense of self-worth or confidence. And you can read the definitions of that. And it often begins slowly, so there is an incident of some kind, and then there's a period of time, and you think, oh, you know, that just happened once. And then it happens again, and you find ways of excusing or explaining it. And so it builds up slowly, like an erosion, that you really don't realize what's happening until the damage is completely done. The repeated interrogations about who you've been with, who you've seen. The victim is frequently accused of having affairs. And of course, the worst fear is that your partner is actually going to leave for someone else. So this is completely irrational, but the way you avoid it, well, if I never leave the house, I can't be accused. It's when you're on the phone with your sister, it's pacing around in the background saying, you're talking to that bitch again on the phone. So then you find, well, I can't call my family members. Cell phones have made it much, much worse. It used to be, you know, you could be out of touch with a landline. Now with the cell phone, people assume I can reach you all the time. You know, I texted you 7 times and you didn't answer. Who were you with? What were you doing? The checking of mileage, that's a frequent kind of thing. I know the grocery store is 2.7 miles and you went 4 miles. Who did you see? What were you doing? You come back and you have the grocery receipt. You think, somehow I'm going to be able to squeeze out the money for my son's field trip, or something that means a lot to you. And it's an item, I'm looking through every single item, giving you the exact, Marlis is nodding her head, it is checking everything you do. And this, so then you begin to isolate more and more. Well, if I don't go out, you never can get it right. At first you think, well, I can get it right. So if you dress up for something, oh, you're dressing up like a slut, you really want to attract somebody. So then you dress down, you slob. Who wants to go out with a slob? Anything you do is not the right thing. But at the beginning of this, you think, well, if I try this or I try that, nothing you do is the right thing, because the goal is not to change your behavior. The goal is to reduce your self-esteem and your confidence until you really feel like a shell and a nothing. The psychological effects of abuse. They're not limited to, but include causing fear or terror. You could just imagine the anxiety that a person feels living with this all of the time. Threatening to or harming the pets, slamming or breaking things, threatening to hurt family, displaying weapons, playing mind games or gaslighting. We've heard that term gaslighting recently. The kind of thing where you always put your car keys one place, and he or the partner will move the keys. They're always in the same place, and they're gone. And so he'll say, you know, I'm really worried about you. You seem to be losing it. You know, you've been doing this more and more. I really think something's wrong with you. So they set it up so that you really start questioning, am I losing my sanity? Is something wrong with me? So self-doubt is a common result. But the impact of this verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, and we're not even talking about physical abuse now, we're talking about the verbal and psychological and emotional, is like a brainwashing. It systematically wears away at the victim's self-confidence, sense of self-worth, trust in your own perceptions and self-concept, and eventually the victim loses all sense of personal value. Let's look at some of the emotional effects. Depression, anxiety attacks, erosion of self-esteem, confusion, trouble concentrating, fear, and we might say mostly terror. Then there are physical effects of this. You can imagine this anxiety that you live with all the time. Sleep deprivation. And an odd thing we hear repeatedly is that abusers do a lot of sleep interruption. So that, and we know from torture, we know from the experiences of torture about what sleep deprivation does. So it's shaking the bed, it's waking up constantly so that you are completely sleep deprived, and you have injuries from physical abuse. And then there are the social effects. You're isolated from friends and family, you have difficulty trusting others, you try to hold a job, you keep on your brave face, always thinking about what it's like to go back home and approaching that door and not knowing what you're going to experience. And then financial, you often have little or no control over any of your financial resources. Cycle of violence, and this happens in some relationships, it does not happen in all, and typically these cycles are spread out but increase over time. So the first cycle is tension building, and this is the time when the victim tries to calm the abuser, walks on eggshells, thinks I can maybe do something to avoid this abuse. The second phase is the abuse phase, and then the third phase is the honeymoon phase. I can't believe I did this to you. You know that I love you more than anything in the world. You know I will never do this again. And this cycle, and I say women because when I worked in the field, it was with women. Many women will describe this cycle. And I remember in group one woman saying there was a family wedding coming up, and she really hoped that her husband could be on his best behavior. And so knowing that the tension was building, she provoked the battering, thinking, okay, it'll be 2 weeks, the bruises will heal, he will still be in the honeymoon cycle, and the family wedding. I see some people nodding like they have heard about this or been through it. So you time these cycles depending on what's going on in your life. Characteristics of abusers. Unlike victims, and I really want to stress this, there are no common characteristics or profile of victims. People will say, well, she must have low self-esteem. The low self-esteem is the result of the abuse. It's not the cause of getting into relationships. And the only thing that I have seen that is common is that there are a number of women who have grown up in abusive homes. And so when they get into a relationship that turns out to be abusive, this doesn't mean that somebody reveals the abuse initially. In fact, most abusers are very seductive, very charming. You would think this is unlike anybody I've ever met. But then when the abuse happens, there's a familiarity about it because you grew up and you think maybe this is what families are like when you close the door. But there really are not common characteristics of victims of abuse. There are, however, common characteristics of abusers. They have as their goal power and control. They are highly emotionally dependent on their partners, highly emotional. They are actually like very little children emotionally. And this is why physical abuse often happens during pregnancy, because as the fetus grows and the partner sees someone else getting their attention, it's like a jealous rage. And then when the baby is born, these grown men will say, you pay more attention to that baby than you pay to me. Some of you have had children maybe 2.5 years apart, and you remember the 2.5-year-old? You're on the phone, and the child is playing very, very nicely, quietly, and then you get on the phone, and then it's mommy, mommy, mommy. It's abusers emotionally, I think, are like 2.5-year-old that for their partner to give their attention to anyone else drives them into a rage. They have total inability to accept responsibility for their own behavior, use projection and denial. It's not my fault, you made me do it. No capacity for empathy. And that's why often abusers are enraged when their partners get sick. That rather than taking care of them, their mommy or their partner is not able to take care of them, so that they are enraged when someone is physically ill. They see family in terms of ownership, jealous of anyone who takes their partner's attention. They are incapable of mature, egalitarian relationships where there is a mutuality, a genuine intimacy. Hypersensitivity, cruelty to animals, rigid gender roles, and a Dr. and Jekyll personality. So they are often one person in the outside world and another at home. The abuse comes out in the intimate relationship. So these are the people where the pastor or a friend or someone would say, oh, not Joe, he would never do that. Because these are often men who are highly successful and charming. So let's talk about some of the causes and contributors. It's the victim's fault. She must like it or she would leave. Mental illness. Persons who are mentally ill have the symptoms of mental illness wherever they are. If you are a schizophrenic, for example, and you exhibit hallucinations, that will happen at home, it will happen in the community. There's a consistency about mental illness. Abusers are one person in the home and another person outside of the home. It is not because of mental illness. So let's look at possible contributors. Systemic issues in our culture. We've been reading the newspaper in the last few weeks. Systemic issues in our culture about how women can be treated. the responses of law enforcement and other agencies of government that might reinforce or re-traumatize the victim. Re-traumatize the victim. Modeling within the family, children's exposure to domestic abuse, and we see this working in emergency shelters, the difference between little girls and little boys at a very young age. The little girls, very quiet, wanting to retreat into the background. The modeling of behavior is be as good and quiet as you can, and you won't get in trouble. And boys at 3 and 4 years of age looking at their mothers and saying, what kind of no don't you understand? I mean, it's stunning how you see in little children how they have already picked up this modeling. And that's why it is so crucial to break this cycle very early. Our society's messages about domestic abuse, oppression of women and other minorities, and just a lot that is unknown about why abusers are constructed in this way. So let's look at some of the barriers to disclosure and why this is often a quiet epidemic. The number one is fear, and that is a real legitimate concern, because the most dangerous time for women or victims is at the time they're thinking about leaving or soon after they have left. The shame of acknowledging that they are in an abusive relationship, guilt, fear of mandatory reporting, not knowing what happened to you or your children. If I disclose to the emergency room doctor or to a police, what's going to happen as a result of that? Immigration status, and we've seen this in the LA Times several times recently, that the calls for domestic abuse in the immigrant community are plummeting because people are afraid of what's happening right now regarding immigration. Language, a difficulty talking about this if it's not your first language, and the cultural and religious restraints. You know, I made a vow for better or for worse. And the barriers to leaving are similar to the barriers to disclosure. Fear of the perpetrator, and all of the other just practical issues. We've heard the statistics about gun violence and domestic abuse, so I won't cover those again. But I will mention an article in Huffington Post on March 3rd of this year entitled, "The Invisible," again invisible, "ways guns are used to keep women in abusive relationships, even if the trigger is never pulled," was based on a recent article in the Journal of Women's Health that highlights the severity of the terror that victims experience when they know a gun is present in the home. It may never be used, but the knowledge that the gun is in the home, it may be displayed, they may hear the noise of the gun being cleaned, and this is terrifying. And a second major reason that it's so difficult to leave is the accumulated effects of the verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, where the victim is so ground down, having no confidence, self-worth, capacity to navigate the very complex steps of leaving and establishing an independent life. And there are also the very practical and financial realities, especially when children are involved. One often faces leaving a home with essentially the clothes you have on your back, leaving everything behind with no sense of how you're going to carve out a future. How does someone leave, move in with someone else or go to a shelter, continue to hold a job when the abuser knows where you work? How do you hold a job when you need time to go court for restraining orders, handle the court-ordered visitation of children? All of that complication because the abuser may have court-ordered visitation, and then you have to arrange things like, often that happens at police stations. You go into the police station, you leave the children, you leave, the abuser picks up the children, and that's where you do the exchange for court-ordered visitations. This isn't a situation where there is a separation or divorce, where there is not fear or terror, where there can be, even though there's a lot of conflict, decisions about division of property and visitation. Facing this decision to leave can literally be a life and death decision. And I do want to mention one of the things I think in terms of prevention, in starting very young and especially working with teens, is to talk about the red flags of abuse. And a very interesting article, I'm surprised I'm saying this out loud, in Cosmopolitan magazine. Several years ago, it was an outstanding article in encouraging women at the beginning of dating relationships, all those questions you ask, where did you grow up, tell me about your family, to ask, do you own a gun? And they had a matrix. If the answer is no, stop. If the answer is yes, well, where did you get it? And listen for, was it at a licensed firearm dealer, or was it, oh, I got it at a gun show, when you live in states without that? You listen for the answers. If the answer is yes, then it goes on to the next question. And it was fascinating to think about this, to start educating people very, very early. So I hope we've covered some of the dynamics. I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'm glad that we're here. Thank you.
We do have.
Thank you very much, Virginia. I really learned a lot from your explanation. I must say I don't know very much about, fortunately, about domestic violence, the way women are kept in this relationship. But one cannot help but wonder if everything that we're reading about in the paper these days about abuse of women by men in sexual situations, when there's a power relationship, if that in fact has a relationship to what you've been talking about. Are those abusers now who are in power, who are sexually assaulting women, are they likely to be in their own relationships, domestic violence, provocateurs, or whatever word you want to use?
I don't know statistics about that. My guess is some are, some aren't, that the sexual abuse has its own dynamics. But the issue for what women internalize when you read those articles is, I'm not going to be protected. You know, for all this bumper sticker stuff is there's no excuse for domestic abuse, and women internalize this is not a safe world in many ways for women, and you're not going to be protected if you speak up. And so it's a very courageous thing when women do actually report and try to take the steps to leave.
Hi, my name is Donna Benjamin. I'm a marriage and family therapist. And I was wondering, we are mandated to report child abuse, dependent adults, and seniors. We're not mandated to report abuse in the home. Would that be helpful? I would think it would be very helpful, but I don't know. I'm just wondering why we don't. I would think the police would take it a little more seriously if we were mandated to report it, but I'm not sure.
I personally have conflicted feelings about that. You are a mandated reporter if there are children involved that have been exposed to domestic abuse. I just don't know how many women would come to counseling or therapy if they were aware of the reporting, because they would feel, I think, a real lack of control over what happens to them. And I think if you go for medical treatment for an injury known to be or thought to be, then that's a mandated reporting. I think that I saw my goal as working with people to have control. I mean, it's the social worker in me, self-determination, to have control over when they wanted to make that call and be in the position at that point to have thought through some of their options and know what plans that to prepare sometimes to leave. Maybe squirreling away some money, taking all your valuable papers and getting those copied and having those put with a friend. That really the safety planning. So I have some ambivalence about that. Yeah.
I wanted to mention I met Gretchen Carlson last week. She's the author of the new book, Be Fierce, went up against the CEO of Fox News. And she was saying with all the women, literally almost, she said at 90, she said I'll go 99.9% that she has talked to, there's a high correlation between domestic violence and women being silent and just submissive to what they deal with in the workplace. And that what she has found is a lot of the men who are the perpetrators of sexual harassment in the workplace, part of this machismo concept of masculine personality, are also ones at dinner parties or hospitality suites whose wives are very submissive and very compliant. And in her view, she thinks there's probably a tremendous correlation with the two. I haven't found any research yet, but I'm looking.
So I've got one here and then.
Hi, it was a great presentation. Imagine, if you will, all the socio-structural, parts of our society work together. And if they did, what sort of socio-structural changes do you think would help to reduce some that dependence financially, just taking one aspect of it? There's a wage gap, and this wage gap is part of that financial barrier, right? And so I was just wondering if you could just offer, a few things like what legislative priorities could be put into place to address the financial dependence, potential financial dependence upon women so that they could be more empowered as a society. And then perhaps I would also demonstrate more egalitarian relationships in our society if they were equal by gender. So do you have any comments on this? Kind of broad, but just wondering what your thoughts are.
Not really. I think that just maybe encouraging women to have their own bank account or have their own resources to make that more acceptable, because that is really a huge issue, that often their names are not on things, to raise that consciousness of having equal access, and that in workplaces could encourage that, where the women work, if they have any kind of investment plans. For me, I think starting very early with children, and I'll just mention one example. Some of you here know that I'm a knitter, a rather addicted knitter. And when I did groups with boys, like 6th, 7th age, one of the things I tried to do was break down gender stereotypes, because those gender stereotypes are so entrenched so early. So we talked in one group about things that are these like boy things or girl things, oh, soccer, oh, boy, playing the violin, girl, and then I said knitting, girl. And then one of the boys said, I always thought that was kind of fun. So I said, well, would you like to learn? Well, if we did it in group and nobody saw, he said, yeah, sure. So these little boys, they were, they were like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. They would come to group and they would sit there and they would love their knitting, but we always left it in group, right? So nobody could see. And then about the 3rd time, this little soccer player, he was walking out and I said, you have your knitting? And he said, yeah, I know. I said, well, in the courtyard, they'll see you. Oh, I don't care. Strutted out with his knitting. And working on empathy. Like, we would have situations on Post-it notes. and they would have to practice saying empathy statements. And, you know, it would come out kind of hard the first time. Oh, I'm real sorry your dog died. You know, so, you know, once more with feeling. But you look at those stereotypes very, very early. And it, also with the financial, that people start having this consciousness at a very young age. And I think this is what it's going to take to break some of these cycles.
We have time for one,
Two, and oh, sorry. Two, and then we'll.
I can tell you from the world of law enforcement, we spent the last probably 30 years trying to get police to focus on the interconnected, co-occurring nature of these crimes. And it's only convenient for government when you separate stalking, sex assault, domestic violence. They all are interconnected. And just as an example, Salem, Oregon, last year, officers asked victims, have you ever been forced to do something of a sexual nature against your will? At a DV call, 80%. The intake person at the Fort Myers, Naples, Florida shelter, 90% rape numbers. My wife's program, 2 years, she's run 20 years of transitional housing in Nashville, almost 90% of her women who come in have been raped. So we're now getting law enforcement to focus on this unbelievable, and what's happened is it's forced government to look at it holistically, not just as domestic violence. It's been convenient for nobody but the government when you separate these crimes out. But that's changing. And we're starting to see a realization that if you abuse your wife, you beat your wife, rape is secondary to that, and it's nothing for the offender to do.
behind you.
Hi, Virginia. I just want to agree with everything that you were saying about kids. I founded a girl empowerment program that I present in the schools, and I used artistic strategies to engage the kids. And just the tweaking, a simple tweaking of their thinking, because they don't get this at home necessarily. Moms, parents aren't telling kids. And just to give girls a different perspective on how to think makes a huge impact. And what I'm also finding is people are saying to me, you got to do a program for boys. You got to do a program for boys. You know, it's this character building that somehow is just not happening anymore. And I totally agree with you that to start it there, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and what Mike Fuhrer was saying about his dad and the programs that his dad did, it is imperative. So thank you for saying that.
One more.
Hi, my name is Sandy. Thank you, Virginia, as always. I wanted to just say that I read an article the other day about shifting language. Instead of calling someone a victim, focus on the abuser. Like, rather than saying, 400 girls were raped, we say 400 men raped girls, or something like that. Like, in other words, it's so passive when we talk about the victim. If we could watch our language and make sure that there's an active person, it's not just that I'm a victim of domestic violence, there is an abuser perpetrating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.